Chapter 3. On this particular Thursday, something was moving quietly through the introsphere at many miles above the surface of the planet. Several somethings, in fact, several dozen huge, yellow, chunky, slab like things. Huge as office blocks, silent as birds. They soared with ease, basking in the electromagnetic rays from the star's soul, biding their time, grouping, preparing. The planet beneath them was almost perfectly oblivious to their presence, which was just how they wanted it for the moment. The huge yellow something unnoticed at Ghoul They passed over Cape Carnival without a blimp. Womeria and Jula Bank looked straight through them, which was a pity because it was exactly the sort of thing they've been looking for all these years. The only place they registered at all was a small black device called a sub-enthesensomatic, which winked away quietly to itself. And nestled in the darkness inside a lizard satchel. Wow. A leather satchel which Ford Prefect habitually wore slung around his neck. The contents of Ford's satchel were quite interesting, in fact, and would have made any Earth's physicist's eyes pop out of his head, which is why he always concealed them by keeping a couple of dog-speared scripts for plays he pretended he was auditioning for stuffed in the top. Besides the sub-enthesensomatic and the scripts he had an electronic thumb, a short, squat black rod, smooth and matte, with a couple of flat switches and dials at one end. He also had a device that looked rather like a largest electronic calculator. This had about 120 flat press buttons and a screen about 4 inches square on which any one of a million pages would be summoned at a moment's notice. It looked insanely complicated, and this was one of the reasons why the snug plastic cover it fitted into had the words "Don't Panic" printed on it in a large friendly font. Why is reading so hard? Golly. Okay, the other reason was that this device was in fact the most remarkable of all the books to ever come out of the great publishing corporation of Ursa Minor, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The reason why it was published in the form of a microscope meson electronic component is that if it were printed in a normal book, an interstellar Hitchhiker would require several inconveniently large buildings to carry it around in. Beneath that in Ford Prefect's satchel were a few ballpoints, a notepad, and a largest bath towel from Marks and Spencer's. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a few things to say on the subject of towels. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly it has a great practical use. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moves of Jagelin Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble sanded beaches of Sagittarius 5, inhaling the heady sea vapors. You can sleep under it beneath the stars, which shine so brightly on the desert of the world. Kafarum. Use it to sail in mini raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. What for it to use in hand-to-hand combat? Wrap it around your head to ward off noxious fumes or avoid the gaze of a ravenous bug-bladder beast of trawl. A mind-boggling stupid animal that assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a brush, but very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergency as a distress sign, and of course dry yourself off of it if it still seems to be clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. For some reason, if a strag, non-hitchhiker, discovers that a hitchhiker has a towel with him, he will automatically assume that he is also in possession of a toothbrush, washcloth, soap, tin of biscuits, flask, compass, map, ball of string, gnat spray, wet weather gear, spacesuit, etc., etc. Furthermore, the strag will be then happily lend the hitchhiker any of those or a dozen other items that the hitchhiker might have accidentally lost. What a strag will think is that any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through, and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. Hence the phrase that had passed into hitchhiking slang, as in, "Hey, you sass that hoopy Ford Prefect, there's a frood who really knows where his towel is." Sass know, beware of, meet, have sex with. Hoopy, really together guy. Frood, really amazingly together guy. Nestling quietly on the top of the salad Ford prefix satchel, the sub-etha sensomatic began to wink more quickly. Miles above the surface of the huge yellow somethings began to fan out. At Jordal Bank, someone decided it was time to have for a nice relaxing cup of tea. You got a towel with you, Ford suddenly said to Arthur. Arthur, struggling through the third pint, looked around at him. Why? What? No, should I have? He'd given up being surprised, and there didn't seem to be any point. There didn't seem to be any point any longer. Oh my goodness. Ford clicked his tongue in irritation. Drink up, he urged. At that moment, the dull sound of rumbling crash from outside filtered through the low murmur of the pub, through the sound of the jukebox, through the sound of the man next to Ford's hiccuping over the whiskey Ford had eventually bought him. Arthur choked on his beer, leapt to his feet. What's this? He yelped. Don't worry, said Ford. They haven't started yet. Thank God for that, said Arthur, relaxed. It's probably just your house being knocked down, said Ford, downing his last pint. What? Shouted Arthur. Suddenly Ford's spell was broken. Arthur wildly looked around at him and ran to the window. My God, they are! They're knocking my house down. What the heck am I doing in the pub, Ford? It hardly makes any difference at this stage, said Ford. Let them have their fun. Fun, yelled Arthur. Fun? He quickly checked out the window again, and they were talking about the same thing. Darn their fun, he hooted. He ran out of the pub, furiously waving an empty beer glass, and made no friends at all in the pub at lunchtime. Stop, you vandals, you homewreckers, bawled Arthur, you half-crazed Visigoths. Stop, will you? Ford would have to go after him. Turning quickly to the barman, he asked for 4 packets of peanuts. There you are, sir. The barman slapping the packets on the bar. 28 pence, if you would be so kind. Ford was very kind. He gave the barman another £5 note and told him to keep the change. The barman looked at it, and then looked at Ford. Suddenly shivered. He experienced a momentary sensation that he didn't understand. Because no one on Earth had ever experienced it before. The moments of the great stress every life form that exists gives out a tiny subliminal signal. This signal simply communicates an exact and almost pathetic sense of how far that it is being from the place of his birth. On Earth, it is never possible to be further than 16,000 miles from your birthplace, which really isn't very far. So such signals are too minute to be noticed. Ford Prefect was at this very moment under great stress, and he was born 600 light years away in the vicinity of Beetlejuice. The barman reeled for a moment, hit by a shocking, comprehensible sense of distance. He didn't know what it meant, but he looked at Ford Prefect with a sense of respect, almost awe. Are you serious, sir? He said in a small whisper that had the effects of silencing the pub. I think the world's going to end. Yes, said Ford. But this afternoon? Ford recovered himself. He was at his flip fist. Yes, he said gaily. Gaily? I don't know what that word says. In less than 2 minutes, I would estimate. The barman couldn't believe this conversation he was having, but he couldn't believe the sensation he just had either. Isn't there anything we could do about it then, he said? No, nothing. Stuffing the peanuts into his pockets. Someone's had hushed the bars. Someone in the hushed bar suddenly laughed I don't know what that word says. Ferociously at how stupid everyone had become. The man sitting next to Ford is a bit startled by now. His eyes weaved their way up to Ford. I thought, he said, that if the world was going to end, we were meant to lie down or put a paper bag over our head or something. If you like, said Ford. That's what they told us in the army, said the man. His eyes began the long trek back towards his whiskey. Well, that helps? Asked the barman. No, said Ford, giving him a friendly smile. Excuse me, he said. I've got to go. With a wave, he left. The pub was silent for a moment longer, and then, embarrassingly enough, the man with the raucous laugh did it again. The girl he had dragged along to the pub with him had grown to loathe him dearly over the last hour, and would probably have been great satisfaction to her to know that in a minute and a half or so he'd suddenly evaporate into a whiff of hydrogen, ozone, and carbon monoxide. However, when the moment came, she too would be too busy evaporating herself to notice it. The barman cleared his throat. He heard himself say, "Last orders, please." The huge yellow machines began to sink downward and move faster. Ford knew what they were, and this wasn't the way he had wanted it. Running up the lane, Arthur had nearly reached his house. He didn't notice how cold it had suddenly become, and he didn't notice the wind. He didn't notice the sudden irrational squall of rain. He didn't notice anything but the caterpillar bulldozers crawling over the rubble that had been his home. "You barbarians!" he yelled. "I'll sue the council for every penny it's got. I'll have you hung, drawn and quartered, and whipped and boiled until you've had enough." Ford was running after him very fast. Very, very fast. "And I'll do it again," yelled Arthur. "And when I've finished, I'll take all the little bits and I will jump on them." Arthur didn't notice that the men were running from the bulldozers. He didn't know that Mr. Prosser was staring hectically into the sky. But what Mr. Prosser had noticed was yellow somethings were screaming through the clouds, and possibly huge yellow somethings. "I'll carry on jumping on them," yelled Arthur, still running, "until I get blisters or anything I can think of anything more unpleasant to do." And then Arthur tripped, fell headlong, rolled, landed flat on his back. At last, he noticed that something was going on. His fingers shot upward. "What the heck is that?" he shrieked. Whatever it was raced across the sky in its monstrous yellowness tone, the sky apart with mind-boggling noise, and leaped off into the distance, leaving the gaping air to shut it behind with a bang that drove your ears 6 feet into your skull. Another one followed and did exactly the same thing, only louder. It was difficult to say exactly what the people on the surface of the planet were doing now, because they didn't really know what they were doing themselves. None of it made a lot of sense. Running into houses, running out of houses, howling noiselessly at the noise. All around the world, city streets exploded with people. Cars skidded into each other as the noise fell on them and rolled off like a tidal wave over hills and valleys, deserts and oceans, seeming to flatten everything in its hit. Only one man stood and watched the sky, stood with terrible sadness in his eye, rubber bungs in his ears. He knew exactly what was happening, and had known it ever since his sensomatic had started winking in the dead of the night beside his pillow and wakened him with a start. It was what he had waited for all these years, but when he had deciphered the signal pattern sitting alone in the small dark room, a coldness had gripped him and squeezed his heart. Of all the races of the galaxy who could have come and said a big hello to the planet Earth, he thought, it didn't just have to be the Vogons. Still, he knew what he had to do. As the Vogon craft screamed through the air above him, he opened his satchel. He threw away a copy of Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and he threw away a copy of Godspell. He wouldn't need them where he was going. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. He knew where his towel was. A sudden silence hit the earth. If anything, it was worse than the noise. For a while, nothing happened. The great ships hung motionless in the sky over every nation on earth. Motionless, they hung, huge, heavy, steady in the sky, a blasphemy against nature. Many people were straight into shock as their minds tried to encompass what they were looking at. The ships hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. And still, nothing happened. Then there was a slight whisper, a sudden spacious whisper of an open ambient sound. Every hi-fi set in the world, every radio, every television, every cassette recorder, every woofer, every tweeter, every mid-range driver in the world quietly turned itself on. Every tin can, every dustbin, every window, every car, every wing glass, every sheet of rusty metal became active as an acoustically perfect sounding board. Before the earth passed away, it was going to be treated to the very ultimate in sound reproduction, the greatest public address system ever built. There is no concert, no music, no fanfare, just a simple message. People of Earth, your attention, please, said the voice, and it was wonderful. Wonderful, perfect, quadrophonetic sound with a distortion level so low as to make a brave man real. This is the Prostek Vojon Jezel of the Galactic Hyperspace Planning Council, the voice continued. As you will no doubt be aware, the plans for development of the outlying regions of the galaxy require the building of a hyperspatial express route through your star system, and regrettably, your planet is one of those scheduled for demolition. The process will take slightly less than 2 of your Earth minutes. Thank you. PA died away. Uncomprehending terror settled on the watching people of Earth. The terror moved slowly through the gathered crowds as if there were an iron fillings on the sheet of board and a magnet was moving beneath them. Panic sprouted again, desperate fleeing panic, but there was nowhere to flee to. Observing this, the Vogons turned on their PA again. It said, "There's no point in acting all surprised about it. All the planning charts and demolition orders have been on display in your local planning department in Alpha Centauri for 50 of your Earth years. We've had plenty of time to lodge any formal complaint, and it's far too late to start making a fuss about it now." The PA fell silent again, and its echo drifted across the land. The huge ship slowly turned in the sky with easy power. On the other side of each hatchway opened an empty black square. By this time, somebody somewhere must have manned a radio transmitter, located a wavelength, and broadcasted a message back to the Vogon ships to plead on behalf of the planet. Nobody ever heard what they said. They only heard the reply. The PA slammed back into life again. The voice, annoyed, said, "What do you mean you've never been to Alpha Centauri? For heaven's sake, mankind, it's only 4 light years away, you know? I'm sorry, but if you can't be bothered to take an interest in local affairs, that's your own. That's your own lookout. Energize the demolition beams. Light poured out into the hatchways." "I don't know," said the voice of the PA. "A apathetic, bloody planet. I've no sympathy at all. Cut it off." There is a terrible, ghastly silence. There's a terribly ghastly noise. There is a terribly ghastly silence. The Vogon constructor fleet coasted away into the inky, starry void.